The Duer-Hearn Case. Written by Alana Sanchez. Narrated by Vivienne. Copyright 2025 Alana Sanchez. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced, edited, copied, altered, printed, shared, unauthorized storage on electronic devices, or distributed without the written permission of the author. Preface. The trouble with this story is that it begins like a romance. Not the kind that announces itself with grand gestures or vows, but the quiet, inevitable kind. Two girls in a small town, close enough that their closeness becomes part of the scenery. In Pocomoke City on Maryland's eastern shore, Lillian Duer and Duer-Hearn walked together so often that people noticed. They were seen arm in arm and hand in hand, their intimacy both ordinary and extraordinary, depending on who was watching. They had been schoolmates, roommates at an academy where they studied hard and graduated with honors. They were clever, respected, and young enough to believe, perhaps, that the world would allow them to stay exactly as they were. It didn't. On November 5, 1878, in the entryway of the Hearn family home, Lillian Duer shot Duer-Hearn. Ella did not die quickly. She lingered for weeks. There were doctors and visitors, inquests and statements, prayers and gossip, the slow conversion of a private bond into public spectacle. A month later, Ella was dead. Lillian fled. In the scramble after the gunshot, she disguised herself in male clothing to escape, and the town that had watched them walk together every day was forced to watch them split apart, one in a sickbed, one on the run. By the following year, the case had moved from parlors into a courtroom in Snow Hill, Maryland. The relationship that had once been a matter of whispers became evidence. The shooting became an argument. The dead girl became a narrative shaped by men in suits and by newspapers hungry for sensation. And when the verdict came, it revealed something that still disturbs. How desperately the world wanted this to be anything but what it appeared to be. This book is a true crime manuscript, and it keeps a strict promise. It will not invent what the record cannot support. There will be no imagined dialogue, no scenes stitched together from convenience, no tidy motives offered as certainty. The 19th century left us fragments, contemporary newspaper reporting, legal summaries, medical statements, the hard dates that survive when everything else dissolves. When the sources disagree, the disagreement will be shown. When a detail is widely repeated but cannot be anchored, it will remain a claim, not a fact. And yet, this is not a sterile book. It cannot be, because the atmosphere is part of the truth. The late 19th century did not have the language we have now. Newspapers struggled to describe what everyone understood and few could name. They called it a female infatuation, an eccentric attachment, an unhealthy passion, anything that would allow them to gesture toward intimacy without saying it plainly. At the same time, those same voices were capable of treating women's violence as accident, hysteria, jealousy, momentary madness, anything but intention. That contradiction sits at the center of this case, and it shapes every page that follows. Because this is not only a story about a murder. It is a story about what a town was willing to see, and what it refused to name. It is a story about a relationship lived in daylight, then punished in public. It is a story about class and respectability, about how a familiar face is granted a softer judgment, about how young women can be treated as too delicate for prison even after another young woman is dead. It is also a story about devotion, the kind that feels like safety until it becomes a trap. If you have come here for certainty, you will be given only what history can honestly supply, a chain of verifiable events, the known names, the known places, the known outcome. If you have come for something darker and more intimate, you will find it in the spaces between the facts, where human emotion presses against the brittle language of the law. In the chapters ahead, we will return to Pocomoke City before it became a headline. We will follow the girls through the academy where they shared a room, through the closeness that drew attention, through the first warning shots in the woods that should have ended everything, and into the entryway where the second shot changed the town forever. We will follow the long month of illness and the strange, clinical language of inquest and cause of death. We will follow the flight, the disguise, the trial, and the verdict. And we will do it without asking you to believe anything that cannot be supported. Because the only honest way to tell a story built on misunderstanding and misdirection is to refuse to mislead you in return. This case has been retold for nearly a century and a half. Often it is framed as scandal. Often it is softened into tragedy. Often it is sensationalized, as though a gunshot could be made entertaining. But at its heart, it remains what it was in 1878. Two girls, a bond that altered the shape of their lives, and a single moment in a domestic doorway that turned love into a crime scene. In this book, we will call it what it was: a murder case. and a romance that the world could not bear to understand. Chapter 1. Pocomoke City was the kind of town that could hold a secret in plain sight for years, provided the secret arrived dressed as something respectable. It sat low on Maryland's eastern shore, framed by water and marsh and the slow certainty of routine. News traveled faster than trains, but it traveled softly, carried on porches and church steps, behind shop counters and through parlors where women traded information like thread. People knew who belonged to whom. They knew which families were established, which ones were rising, which ones had suffered a recent blow. They knew, too, how to look away when looking too closely would cause trouble. Into that small, watchful world came the Hearn family, settling in town some years before the shooting that would make their name infamous. Not everyone is remembered in history, but Ella Hearn was remembered because she died, and because the circumstances of her death forced the town to name what it would rather have left unnamed. Ella was young, educated, and well-regarded. She moved in the orbit of the town's respectable families, the kind of girl people spoke of with approval. Clever, accomplished, and poised to become the sort of woman whose future would unfold in predictable stages. Then there was Lillian Duer. Lillian, often recorded as Lily or Lily, came from a similarly respectable background. She was intelligent, described in later synthesis of the case as well-read, and a gifted writer, and she carried herself with a kind of restless energy that people alternately admired and distrusted. She was, in the words of those who watched her, eccentric. In a larger city, eccentricity might have been fashionable. In a small town, it was a warning label. She was also known for things young women were not meant to be known for. She carried a revolver. She could shoot. She sometimes dressed in ways people considered masculine, at least for certain activities, and she was the sort of girl who would take other girls out for target practice. It sounded like mischief when it was told at the dinner table. It sounded like something else entirely after a pistol discharged in the Hearn family home. But none of that was the story at first. At first, the story was devotion. Somewhere within the academy years, those years when young people lived pressed together in classrooms and dormitories, in a world of shared books and shared hours, Ella Hearn and Lillian Duer became inseparable. They were roommates at school, and they graduated with honors. The closeness that forms between roommates can be ordinary. It can also become, quietly, the most important relationship in a person's life. In their case, that closeness did not dissolve after graduation. It followed them home. People in Pocomoke City saw them together constantly. A later overview built from period reporting states that after the Hearn family moved into town, the two girls were together nearly every day, often walking arm in arm or hand in hand. That detail matters because it places their relationship not in the shadows, but in the open. This was not an affair hidden in backrooms. This was intimacy lived on the street. And because it was lived on the street, the town interpreted it. Some would have thought it sweet. Two girls intensely fond of one another, choosing companionship over the noise of young men. Others would have found it disturbing, not because they had proof of anything scandalous, but because the closeness was too complete, too sustained, too emotionally charged to fit neatly into the acceptable category of friendship. In the late 19th century, people often lacked language for what they were seeing, but they still reacted to it. The newspapers later would struggle to describe it too, reaching for phrases that hinted at passion while pretending it was merely infatuation. The town watched. The town murmured. The town did what towns do. It filed the relationship away as an eccentricity, a phase, something that would surely correct itself once marriage arrived and rearranged everything into the approved shape. But there are relationships that do not wait politely for correction. Ella and Lillian's closeness did not fade. It tightened. It became, by most accounts, the axis around which their lives turned. Ella was not merely Lillian's friend, she was her person. And when a relationship becomes that central, it becomes fragile. It becomes vulnerable to anything that threatens it, any rival, any rumor, any shift in attention that suggests the bond is not exclusive. This is where the first dangerous truth appears, the one that would later make everything else feel inevitable. Whatever was happening between them, it was intense enough to provoke violence. Before the fatal shooting, there was another incident, one that should have ended the story before it reached tragedy. In October 1878, during a walk in the woods, Lillian fired shots that narrowly missed Ella. 3 shots, in some accounts. When confronted, she claimed she only meant to frighten her. That detail is like a hairline crack that you only see clearly after the glass shatters. A person who fires at someone to frighten them has already crossed a line most people will never approach. It suggests a willingness to use fear as a kind of control. It suggests a relationship in which emotion has turned predatory, where one person believes she has the right to punish the other for withdrawing affection. In a different story, the woods would have been the climax. People would have intervened. Someone would have been sent away. A family would have cut contact. The town would have decided, finally, that this was not merely eccentricity. Instead, the relationship continued. And so did the town's habit of looking away. The truth is that Pocomoke City did not see the danger coming because the danger wore a familiar face. It wore youth. It wore education. It wore respectability. It wore the image of two girls walking together in daylight, arms linked, as if nothing in the world could ever pry them apart. But love, whatever form it takes, can become its own kind of possession. And possession, when threatened, does not always ask permission. By early November 1878, the town was still watching two girls in a small town. It had no idea it was watching the beginning of a murder case. And Duer-Hearn had no idea that the safest place in her life, her own home, was about to become a crime scene. Chapter 2. If Pocomoke City was the place that watched them, the academy was the place that made them. It is one of the few solid points we have before the gunshot. Lillian Duer and Duer-Hearn were not casual acquaintances who drifted into a friendship by chance. They were schoolmates. They were roommates. They lived, for a time, in the peculiar intimacy of girls' education in the late 19th century. Shared rooms, shared hours, shared books, shared secrets. They studied hard, and they graduated with honors. That detail matters because it tells you the kind of young women they were expected to become. Disciplined, respectable, admired. The sort of girls whose futures are meant to unfold neatly. Marriage, home, children, the quiet continuation of family name. For a girl like Ella, the academy would have been a finishing as much as an education. It taught the mind, yes, but it also taught posture, deportment, the subtle art of becoming acceptable. It produced young women who could take their place in parlors and churches and social visits without disrupting the order of things. A good education did not exist to liberate them. It existed to polish them. But the academy had another function, one rarely acknowledged in official descriptions. It created rooms where girls could be close to one another without supervision that felt constant. Friendships formed quickly and deeply in that environment. Sometimes they remained friendships. Sometimes they became something harder to name. This is where the story begins to turn, not into scandal, but into devotion. Roommates share a life that no outsider can fully see. They learn each other's rhythms. They fall asleep within earshot. They wake to the same morning. They become each other's witness. In a world where a young woman's freedoms were narrow, the room she shared with another girl could feel like the only place where she belonged to herself and to the person beside her. That was the room Ella and Lillian shared. They left the academy with honors, which meant they left it with approval. Teachers had validated them. Families would have been proud. Their accomplishments would have been discussed as evidence of promise. On the surface, the academy years were exactly what society wanted. Two gifted girls educated into refinement. But on the inside the room, inside the closeness, something formed that didn't fit easily back into the town's expectations. The difficulty of writing this part of the story is that the 19th century did not preserve queer women's love in clean, straightforward language. Newspapers at the time could not, or would not, say plainly what they believed. They wrote around it. They wrapped it in euphemism. They described it as eccentricity, infatuation, or a kind of excessive friendship. Even later accounts that draw on those newspaper records reflect the same tension. They describe intimacy that looks unmistakable, and then they soften it, as though love between women must be translated into something less direct to be accepted. But the behavior that survives in the record is hard to dismiss. In later accounts built from period reporting, the girls were described as being together nearly every day after they returned to Pocomoke City, often walking arm in arm and hand in hand. That is not the ordinary behavior of acquaintances. It is not even the ordinary behavior of close friends. It is the behavior of people who have decided, consciously or not, that the world will see them as a pair. And the world did. In a small town, the academy room did not stay private forever. It followed them home. It shaped how they stood, how they touched, how they moved through the street. It shaped the kind of glances people gave them, the indulgent kind, the curious kind, the troubled kind. For a while, that may have felt like a triumph. Youth often mistakes intensity for permanence. It can feel, in the beginning, that the bond itself is strong enough to protect you. That whatever people whisper will eventually fade. That being clever and respectable will make you safe. But safety is not only about who you are. It is about what others are prepared to accept. The academy had trained them to be admirable, but admiration is not the same as permission. A town can admire a clever girl and still expect her to become a wife. It can praise a talented girl and still demand that her devotion is eventually redirected to a man. It can tolerate closeness in youth and still insist that it is merely a stage. And when the town insists on a story that doesn't match the truth inside a room, pressure builds. This is why the academy matters. Because whatever happened between them began in a space where their bond was normalized by circumstance. They were roommates. They were girls. They were allowed to be close. The academy gave them a kind of sanctioned intimacy. But once they returned to the wider world, that intimacy became something else. Visible, remarked upon, interpreted. And when something is interpreted by others, it becomes vulnerable. It becomes subject to interference. It is in that vulnerability that jealousy grows. We know, from the later narrative of the case, that jealousy would become one of the most frequently repeated explanations for what followed. Lillian's anger at the possibility that Ella's affection was shifting to someone else. The name that enters the story later, another girl, another attachment, does not arrive out of nowhere. It arrives because the relationship that began in the academy room had made exclusivity feel natural. It had made possession feel like love. This is not to romanticize it. It is to recognize the pattern. The academy produced not just educated girls, but a bond so intense it became the axis of their lives. And when an axis shifts, the world can tilt. Lillian Duer, in particular, is described by later sources as intelligent and gifted, well-read, a talented writer, qualities that can make a person more sensitive, not less. A vivid mind does not always protect you from emotional extremity. Sometimes it fuels it. Sometimes it supplies the words to justify it. Sometimes it builds an internal theater so convincing that reality becomes secondary. And then there was the revolver. The record suggests Lillian's relationship with weapons was not incidental. She carried a pistol. She shot. She took other girls out for target practice. In a town that could be dismissed as an eccentric hobby, a spirited girl doing spirited things. In hindsight, it becomes something more ominous. A young woman comfortable with the weight of a gun in her hand, familiar with what it felt like to point and fire. The academy, of course, did not teach her that. But it may have taught her something equally dangerous: confidence. The sense that she could shape her own life. The sense that she did not have to be like other girls. In the beginning, those qualities would have been intoxicating. They would have made her alluring. They would have made the bond between them feel like an escape from the ordinary. But the ordinary always returns. It returned in the form of community expectation. It returned in the form of watchful eyes. It returned in the form of a third presence, or the idea of one, standing at the edge of the relationship like a shadow. And that is where the academy's beautiful, enclosed intimacy begins to fracture. Because a bond formed in a shared room can feel absolute. But outside that room, the world keeps touching you. It keeps pulling. It keeps insisting. Soon, what began as devotion in an academy room would become something else entirely. Something volatile. Something that could not be contained by honor certificates or polite smiles. A relationship that had once been a refuge would begin to feel like a siege. And the girl who carried the revolver would begin, slowly, to treat love as something she had the right to enforce. Chapter 3. In a small town, love is never only between two people. It is between two people and the air around them. Between two people and the way the street remembers. Between two people and the certainty that everyone is watching even when nobody is looking directly. And when a relationship is already being translated by outsiders. When a bond is described as too close, eccentric, unhealthy, or simply strange, it becomes vulnerable to the smallest shift. A glance held too long with someone else. A visit that lingers. A name repeated with warmth. That is how the third name enters a story like this. Not as an intruder at first, but as a possibility. The record we have does not give us the full private unfolding of the triangle. The quiet conversations, the long looks, the uncertain gestures that might have preceded the crisis. What it gives us is the outline that later reporting settled on as explanation. Jealousy. The idea that Lillian Duer, who had treated Duer-Hearn's devotion as a kind of possession, began to feel the bond slipping. That she could not bear the thought of Ella's affection turning elsewhere. That the relationship that had been sustained by intensity became threatened by ordinary change. The name that appears in surviving accounts is another young woman, Ella Foster. This is one of the most significant identifying details preserved in the narrative of the crime, because it gives jealousy a shape. It turns vague suspicion into a person. It also complicates the story, because it forces us to confront the thing the 19th century would not say plainly. These were not merely friends. The language used in many accounts may have been careful, but the emotional stakes were not. The conflict that emerges is not the conflict of a casual friendship. It is the conflict of a primary attachment. What happened between Ella Hearn and Ella Foster, how they became close, how visible it was, how quickly it developed, is not detailed cleanly in the accessible record we are working from. The sources mention Foster because she becomes the hinge on which the fatal conversation turns. She appears in the story at the moment when Lillian demands a declaration and cannot tolerate the answer. But before we reach that moment, it is worth stepping back and understanding what jealousy meant in a world like this. Jealousy between women was not treated as jealousy between lovers. It was treated as girlhood emotion, as hysteria, as melodrama. Something intense but unserious, something that would eventually dissolve into marriage and maternity. That cultural assumption was one of Lillian's protections. It allowed people to see the bond between the girls as excessive but harmless. It allowed them to treat warning signs as temperament rather than threat. It also meant that when jealousy flared, it could be dismissed as drama. And drama in a town is entertaining, until it becomes gunfire. In later retellings drawn from period reporting, Lillian Duer's temperament is described in ways that now read like a set of alarms. She was impulsive, sometimes called eccentric, known for carrying a revolver. She was the sort of girl who did not sit gently inside expectations. That could make her fascinating. It could also make her frightening. The difference between those two perceptions often depends on whether the observer feels personally at risk. For a while, the town did not feel at risk. Ella Hearn was safe in her family home. Lillian was a familiar face. Their closeness was visible, yes, but it was still located within respectable circles. Educated girls from good families, seen together daily, their devotion still framed as youthful attachment. The town had 1,000 ways to explain it without facing what it might actually be. But when the third name appeared, when the possibility of another relationship emerged, those explanations began to fail. Because if Ella could love someone else, then the bond with Lillian was not a phase. It was a choice. And if it was a choice, then the jealousy was not childish. It was romantic. It was adult. It carried a different kind of danger. It is at this point that the story begins to show its fatal inevitability. You cannot build a relationship on exclusivity and then expect it to tolerate change. You cannot encourage a love that consumes and then be surprised when it turns predatory. And you cannot place a revolver into the hands of someone already struggling with control and expect the outcome to remain harmless. The town, of course, did not describe it that way. The town would have described it as unfortunate, sad, a quarrel, girl, trouble, the sort of language that shrinks the danger into something manageable. But the record gives us one undeniable fact that proves how far things had already escalated before the fatal day. In October 1878, weeks before the shooting in the Hearn home, there was a walk in the woods, and there were shots. Accounts drawn from contemporary reporting describe Lillian firing 3 shots that narrowly missed Ella. When confronted, she claimed she only meant to frighten her. That is not a harmless quarrel. That is an attempted demonstration of power. That is a person using a gun to control another person's movement, to punish, to threaten, to terrify. Even if the bullets missed, the message could not. A gun fired to frighten is still a gun fired with intent to intimidate. It is violence disguised as warning. It is also, in hindsight, a rehearsal. Because once a gun is introduced into a relationship, the relationship changes. The possibility of lethal harm becomes real. Fear enters. Trust fractures. The victim begins to understand that a line has been crossed, that the other person is willing to pull a trigger not in accident, but in emotion. The tragedy is that the story did not end in the woods. It should have. It could have. Someone could have intervened. Someone could have demanded that the girls be kept apart. Someone could have recognized that this was not merely romantic distress, but a threat to life. Instead, the relationship continued. The third name continued to exist as a shadow between them. And the town continued to behave as though the danger was imaginary. This is the part of the story that reads like slow motion. You can see the gun in the hand. You can see the jealousy tightening. You can see the relationship turning from devotion to siege. You can see the small town's refusal to take it seriously. And you can see, as though the day itself is moving toward it, the entryway of the Hearn home waiting like a stage. Because the third name does not merely introduce jealousy. It introduces decision. Someone must choose. Someone must admit where their affection lies. Someone must accept being left behind. And in the version of this story that survives in later accounts, Lillian Duer could not accept it. She wanted an answer. She wanted a declaration. And when she finally demanded it, the words she heard were enough to turn a threat into a killing. In the next chapter, we will step into the woods of October 1878 and treat that earlier incident not as a footnote, but as what it truly was, the first shot in a story that would end with death. Because by the time a gun is fired in warning, the relationship has already entered the territory of crime. And the only question left is whether anyone will stop it before it becomes irreversible. Chapter 4. The first time she fired at her, it happened away from the town. No parlor witnesses. No neighbors at windows. No family in the next room. Just trees, the rough hush of the eastern shore, and two young women walking where they believed they could be alone. It is tempting, when you know what comes next, to treat this moment as a rehearsal. To see it as the opening act of a tragedy that was already written. But that kind of certainty is the luxury of hindsight. For the two girls in the woods, it would have felt like something else entirely. An argument, a rupture, a sudden flare of danger that still didn't look like murder because the world had not yet forced that word into their mouths. The surviving accounts place this incident in October 1878, only weeks before the shooting in the Hearn family home. The detail that remains consistent in later retellings drawn from period reporting is stark. Lillian Duer fired 3 shots that narrowly missed Ella Hearn. We do not have, in the accessible record we are working from, a precise day, a precise location within the woods, or a transcript of their conversation before the gun was raised. The sources do not preserve the weather, the angle of the light, the exact path of the walk. This is one of the brutal limitations of historical true crime. The moments that matter most were often the least documented until after someone died. What we do have is the shape of the act. They were walking and Lillian fired. 3 shots. Close enough to miss only narrowly. If you strip away everything else, that is the fact that changes the story. Because a gunshot in the woods is not ambiguous. It cannot be smoothed over into mere emotion. It is a physical escalation, a leap over a boundary most people never cross. There are only so many ways to interpret 3 shots fired at close range in a secluded place. Either the shooter meant to hit, or the shooter meant to terrify. Either way, the act is violence. When Ella confronted her afterwards, when she demanded to know what she had done and why, Lillian reportedly offered an explanation that sounds, at first glance, almost childish. She said she had only intended to frighten her. Only intended to frighten her. Those words deserve to be held up to the light, because they contain the entire logic of coercion. To frighten someone is to assert control over them. To frighten someone with a gun is to demonstrate that your emotions can become lethal at any moment, and that the other person's safety depends on your mood. It is a demand disguised as warning. Stay close, stay loyal, stay mine, or this is what I can do. It also suggests something more chilling. That Lillian believed fear was an acceptable tool inside their relationship. That she believed she had the right to use terror to keep Ella from leaving. That she was not simply distressed, but willing to punish. The record does not tell us exactly what Ella did after this incident. We do not have preserved letters in which she confides her fear. We do not have a diary entry where she decides whether to end the relationship, or whether she even thought she could. We do not have a surviving, dated statement from the moment that says, "I was afraid of her, and I should never see her again." Instead, what we have is what came next. The relationship did not end. This is one of the most painful truths about violence that begins as warning. Sometimes the victim does not leave. Sometimes the victim cannot. Sometimes affection and fear are tangled together so tightly that even a gunshot doesn't sever the bond. Sometimes the world around them, family, friends, the town itself, does not treat the warning as real enough to intervene. And sometimes the shooter, having fired once and survived the consequences, learns something dangerous. That the act itself does not automatically destroy the relationship. That even fear can be folded back into intimacy. That the other person may still return. This is how warning violence becomes normalized. And once it is normalized, the threshold for the next escalation drops. There is a specific kind of cruelty in the fact that the first shots were fired in the woods. The woods are where people go to breathe. The woods are where they go to escape the eyes of others. The woods are meant to be freedom. But in this story, the woods become a place where privacy turns into vulnerability. No one sees what happens there. No one stops it. And because no one stops it, the incident can be reshaped afterwards. It can be explained away. It can be retold as drama, as a misunderstanding, as a girl's wild moment that surely won't happen again. The phrase, "only meant to frighten her," is exactly the kind of phrase that allows people to accept violence without naming it as violence. It is language designed to soften a gun into a gesture. But a gun is never a gesture. A gun is a decision. 3 shots, fired close enough to miss only narrowly, are not the acts of someone who merely wishes to make a point. They are the acts of someone who has already, in her mind, placed the other person inside the scope of harm. If that moment had been taken seriously, if someone had looked at those shots and understood what they meant, Duer-Hearn might have lived. Instead, the woods became a secret in the way small towns keep secrets, not by hiding them, but by not turning them into action. And so the story moved forward, as though the first violence could be shrugged off, as though the relationship could continue without consequence, as though fear could be swallowed and made invisible. But fear does not dissolve. It waits. It settles into the body like a second heartbeat, always alert. It changes the way a person listens to footsteps, the way they respond to a voice, the way they interpret a gesture. It makes the world narrow. It makes choices feel impossible. By the time November arrived, the gun had already been introduced into their story. The first shots had already been fired. The idea of death had already entered the relationship, not as a metaphor, but as a possibility. The woods, in October 1878, were not just the scene of an incident. They were the moment the case crossed from romance into threat. They were the moment the town should have understood that what it was watching was not merely devotion. It was danger, and the person holding the revolver was willing to prove it. Chapter 5. There is a reason the woods matter as much as the doorway. Because the woods were not merely a backdrop for a quarrel. They were the moment a relationship crossed a line, quietly, invisibly, and became something else. In modern language, the behavior described in the record is consistent with domestic violence. More specifically, it is consistent with coercive control, a pattern in which one person uses fear, threats, intimidation, and emotional pressure to dominate another person's choices. The 19th century did not name it that way. It did not even possess a socially acceptable vocabulary for a romantic relationship between two women. But the absence of language does not erase reality. It only makes it harder to describe, and easier for others to minimize. When Lillian Duer fired shots at Duer-Hearn and later claimed she had only meant to frighten her, she revealed something that appears again and again in coercive relationships: the belief that fear is a legitimate tool. There is a difference between anger and control. Anger flares. Control calculates. Only meant to frighten her is not the language of accident. It is the language of strategy. It suggests the weapon was used deliberately, not as a spontaneous mistake, but as a demonstration. In coercive dynamics, that demonstration is a lesson delivered with force. I can do this. I can make you afraid. I can decide whether you are safe. Even if Ella returned to her after that incident, if she continued to walk with her, continue to meet her, continue to keep the relationship intact, that does not prove she was unafraid. Victims often remain in violent relationships for reasons outsiders misunderstand. They stay because they love the person. They stay because they fear what leaving will provoke. They stay because the violence is followed by remorse, tenderness, tears, and promises. They stay because the world around them does not recognize the danger, and so the victim has no social permission to treat it as danger. And in this case, the surrounding world had every reason to look away. The relationship itself could not be spoken about plainly. If you cannot name the love, it becomes harder to name the violence inside it. What language would Ella have used in a Victorian town to describe why she was afraid? How does a girl say, "She fired at me because I belong to her," when the world will not permit her to say she belongs to her at all? This is why the case feels so cruelly modern. The relationship existed in daylight, but its nature was always being translated into something safer by those who watched. The violence, when it arrived, could be translated in the same way, not as domestic violence, not as coercive control, but as girl trouble, melodrama, emotion, eccentricity. Until the gunshot in the doorway forced the town to look. The early warning sign is already there in the clearest possible form: shots fired to frighten. Modern domestic violence research treats threats involving weapons, especially the demonstration of lethal capacity, as major escalation markers. It is not merely anger. It is dominance. It is a declaration of power. Your safety depends on my mood. And the person on the receiving end learns to manage that mood. If Duer-Hearn was seen arm in arm, hand in hand with Lillian nearly every day, as later accounts derived from period reporting suggest, she may have been performing harmony as much as affection. Victims learn that public calm can keep private danger at bay. If the controlling partner feels secure, the risk of escalation can temporarily fall. The victim becomes an emotional caretaker, not because she is weak, but because she is trying to survive. Then comes the third name, Ella Foster, and the shape of control tightens. Jealousy is not automatically abuse. But jealousy becomes abusive when it is fused with entitlement, the belief that another person's affection belongs to you, and that any shift away is betrayal. In coercive relationships, the offender treats the victim's independence as provocation. A new friendship becomes infidelity. A separate life becomes disloyalty. Normal boundaries become rejection. The record suggests that some version of this occurred. The jealousy narrative appears consistently in later accounts. Lillian demanding answers, pressing Ella, reacting to the possibility of being replaced. This matters because coercive control is often triggered, sometimes violently, by perceived abandonment. The moment the victim tries to leave, or chooses someone else, or reclaims autonomy, the offender escalates to reassert dominance. This chapter is not here to make the story tidy. It is here to make it legible. And it is here to do something that true crime writers must do with care. To look at documented behavior and ask how modern clinical frameworks might interpret it, while also refusing to turn speculation into fact. We cannot diagnose Lillian Duer. Not from newspapers, not from court summaries, not from the dramatic retellings that followed. A diagnosis requires direct assessment, developmental history, collateral interviews, and evidence of long-term patterns across contexts. We do not have those things. We have fragments, and we have the record of one relationship collapsing into violence. But if a clinician today heard these facts, shots fired to frighten, escalating jealousy, fear used as a relational tool, they might consider certain diagnostic frameworks as part of an assessment, not as labels to excuse, but as lenses to understand. One possibility, in modern terms, might be borderline personality traits, or borderline personality disorder. BPD can involve intense attachments, extreme sensitivity to rejection, fear of abandonment, emotional volatility, impulsivity, and in some cases, threats or aggression during relational crisis. The constellation of devotion turning into terror, the apparent trigger of replacement, and the escalation into weaponized intimidation could be seen as consistent with that kind of pattern. But this is only a hypothesis. BPD requires a broader, enduring pattern beginning by early adulthood and spanning multiple domains: identity disturbance, chronic instability, recurrent self-harm or suicidality in many cases, and more. The record does not preserve enough of Lillian's life to claim those criteria were met. And it is crucial to say this plainly: a person can be controlling and violent without meeting any psychiatric diagnosis at all. In fact, the most fitting modern framework here may not be DSM-based at all. It may simply be coercive control, because coercive control does not require a disorder. It requires entitlement. It requires possession. It requires a willingness to use fear to shape another person's behavior. It requires the belief that love grants ownership. And the record gives us at least one act that reveals that belief: a gun fired to frighten. In that sense, what matters most is not what might be in Lillian's diagnostic file, had she lived in our era and been assessed by a clinician. What matters is what happened between these two girls as a pattern. Intimacy becoming surveillance, devotion becoming threat, emotion becoming weapon. So how would Ella have viewed it? We cannot know the private language of her mind. We can only infer what victims often report in similar dynamics, and what the facts suggest she experienced. She may have minimized it because the alternative was unbearable: to accept that someone she loved was capable of killing her. Victims often cling to the offender's softer explanation: she only meant to frighten me, because the harder truth is too terrifying to hold in daylight. She may have felt responsible for calming Lillian, for being careful with her words, for avoiding jealousy triggers, for keeping the peace. Victims often become managers of another person's volatility. She may have felt trapped by the social structure around her. A Victorian town did not provide an easy pathway for a young woman to report intimate partner violence, and it provided even less when the relationship itself was unspeakable. And she may have believed, desperately, that the woods were the worst of it, that a warning shot was the peak, not the beginning. The tragedy is that warning violence rarely remains warning. Once the offender learns that fear works, once they learn that the victim stays, the threshold shifts. The weapon has been introduced. The relationship has been rewritten. After the woods, everything becomes conditional. Every argument becomes dangerous. Every refusal becomes a potential trigger. Every declaration of independence becomes a risk. And when the moment arrives where the victim speaks the truth the offender cannot bear, the moment of choosing, the moment of confession, coercive control often demands punishment. We do not need to invent motives to see the pattern. It is visible in what survives: the intimidation in the woods, the claim it was meant as fear, the jealousy narrative, and the final gunshot in the doorway. The 19th century refused to call it domestic violence. But that is what it resembles, and that is how it functions. Not as a sudden, inexplicable tragedy, but as an escalation of control. Introduced quietly, rehearsed in the woods, then executed in a home. Sometimes the most dangerous part of a romance is not that it ends. It is that one person decides the other is not allowed to leave. And sometimes, the first sign is not a bruise. It is 3 shots in the trees. Chapter 6. The doorway is the most domestic place in a house. It is where people arrive with ordinary news. Where neighbors are received. Where errands begin and end. Where a mother calls someone back inside because the air has turned cold. It is not in the imagination of a town like Pocomoke City, a place where death should happen. But on Tuesday, November 5, 1878, the entryway of the Hearn family home became the center of a case that would travel far beyond Maryland's eastern shore. What follows is the closest reconstruction we can make from the surviving record we have in hand. Some details are preserved in later summaries that draw from period reporting. Some come from inquest reporting reprinted in regional papers. Some come from modern historical synthesis that cites those sources. Where the record does not preserve a name or a precise moment, the absence remains. This story does not get to be embroidered simply because it would be easier to read. Lillian Duer and Ella Hearn were young. In one well-sourced summary built from contemporary coverage, Ella was 18 and Lillian was 20. They belonged to respectable families, educated girls in a community where people watched each other the way they watched weather, quietly, constantly. Their closeness had been visible for years. They had been schoolmates, roommates at an academy, and after the Hearn family moved into town the girls were seen together almost every day, walking arm in arm and hand in hand. The town had filed their devotion under oddity, under intensity, under a closeness that would surely correct itself. By November it had not corrected. It had tightened. The record most often preserves the pressure point as jealousy, sharpened by the presence of another girl's name, Ella Foster. That name appears in surviving accounts because it is tied to the emotional trigger at the heart of the confrontation. Lillian pressing Ella for reassurance, demanding loyalty, reacting violently to the idea of replacement. The details of the conversation are not preserved in an official transcript in the sources currently in hand, but the broad shape is repeated. Lillian went to the Hearn home, a confrontation occurred, and the dispute turned lethal. The gun was already part of Lillian's life. It was not an unfamiliar object she stumbled upon in a moment of madness. Contemporary derived accounts describe her as a girl who carried a revolver and took other girls out for target practice. That reputation, which may have sounded like spirited eccentricity in peaceful months, became something else when the pistol discharged in a domestic doorway. Then there was the shot. A dramatic scene survives in the retellings that draw from period accounts. A neighbor passing the house heard a pistol report and a scream and ran inside. In the sources we currently have, the neighbor is not named, and we cannot responsibly supply a name without the trial testimony that likely preserves it. But the image remains because it is so immediate, and because it captures the instant the private became public. Ella Hearn was found on the floor, wounded, her hands clasped over her mouth in an attempt to stop the bleeding. Standing over her was Lillian Duer, holding the pistol, described in that account as still smoking. In that same version, Lillian told a neighbor to run for a doctor. Then she began to weep bitterly. This is where the case splits into the competing narratives that would haunt it for months. One narrative is intention, jealousy, possession, a confrontation that escalates into a threat and then a gunshot. The other is accident, a pistol handled carelessly, a discharge no one meant, a tragedy without design. 19th century reporting often allowed both narratives to sit side by side because the public struggled to accept what the scene implied, that a young woman had shot another young woman in a domestic setting, in a place meant to be safe. Even when newspapers hinted at motive, they often retreated into softer explanations. Women's violence was frequently treated as impossible, or else explained away as emotion, hysteria, and aberration. But a gunshot does not care what a town prefers to believe. Regardless of motive, the pistol was in Lillian Duer's hand. The wound was real. Ella's blood was real. A neighbor heard it. A doctor was called. The Hearn family's doorway became a crime scene, whether anyone wished to call it that or not. The record does not explicitly state which members of the Hearn family stood in the entryway at the exact instant the pistol fired. Yet the aftermath makes one thing clear. The event belonged to the household immediately, and to the father whose name survives in the record with unusual clarity. Ella's father was Jason Hearn. His name matters because he did not allow the case to remain only a whispered scandal. Jason Hearn became central to the aftermath, and later reporting preserves his actions. After Ella died, he asked the town magistrate to summon a coroner's jury to determine liability. In other words, he insisted that the death be treated not as gossip or misfortune, but as a matter for formal judgment. Medical care arrived. One physician's name is preserved, Dr. David Truitt, the Hearn family doctor. He treated Ella and made a decision that would later sit at the center of dispute. He chose not to remove the bullet. The reason is generally described as medical risk, but whatever the reasoning, the consequence was the same. The wound remained lodged within her, and her suffering stretched into weeks. Ella did not die quickly. This fact altered everything. An immediate death produces a clean narrative. A lingering death produces argument, doubt, and the slow formation of competing truths. While Ella lived, the town could tell itself the story it preferred. While Ella lived, Lillian could claim accident. While Ella lived, the case remained suspended, neither fully tragedy nor fully murder. But the longer Ella lingered, the more the story fermented. The Hearn house became a place of fear and vigilance. Visitors came. Doctors came. The town listened for updates the way it listens for the outcome of a storm. And then, after roughly a month, Ella died. Inquest reporting reprinted in newspapers uses the language of its time. One coroner's jury verdict, later reproduced in a Pennsylvania paper, stated that Ella Hearn came to her death from nervous depression, caused by a ball shot from a pistol in the hand of Miss Lillian Duer at Pocomoke City on November 5, 1878. Another report notes that after her death a coroner's inquest was held, with an acting coroner summoning a jury. Those phrases, nervous depression, nervous prostration, excited by the ball, are the 19th century struggling to describe what modern readers would recognize as trauma and bodily collapse following a gunshot wound. The terminology is archaic. The meaning is not. Ella died because she had been shot. After her death, the coroner's jury was convened at Jason Hearn's request. Several doctors conducted an autopsy. The jury heard testimony from members of the Hearn family, from Lillian Duer, and from caretakers who had attended Ella. With that, the case left the realm of rumor and entered the machinery of the state. This was the moment the town's careful fictions began to collapse. For years, Pocomoke had contained the girls' relationship by treating it as an eccentricity. It had allowed itself not to look too closely, not to ask what the intimacy meant, not to admit what the bond might have been. After the shooting, the town tried the same tactic with the violence. It tried to soften it into accident, into misfortune, into a horrible mistake committed by a girl who could not possibly have meant it. But the evidence refused softness. Ella's body refused it. The coroner's verdict refused it. The lodged bullet refused it. The doctor's testimony refused it. And Jason Hearn's insistence on formal inquiry refused it. The doorway became more than the site of a shooting. It became the threshold where intimacy turned into evidence, where devotion became motive, where a private bond became a matter for the law. In the weeks that followed, the case gathered a second life in the press, described as strange, sensational, and scandalous. The language of strange developments appears early, signaling what newspapers could not quite say plainly, that the relationship at the heart of the case made the violence both irresistible to print and difficult to name. And that is why the entryway matters. Not because it was the most dramatic setting, but because it was the most ordinary. A domestic place made violent. A familiar girl holding a weapon. A family home transformed into the beginning of a murder case. Chapter 7. After the gunshot, time did not behave normally. The town had expected a scandal. Whispers, glances, the familiar rhythm of people disapproving in private and being polite in public. It had not expected an interval. It had not expected the drawn-out cruelty of a wounded girl who did not die, and a shooter who did not vanish neatly into guilt or confession. Instead, what followed was a month in which everything stayed suspended. The victim alive, but failing, the truth unstable, and the entire relationship slowly pulled into public view. We can place the shooting with certainty. It occurred on the afternoon of Tuesday, November 5, 1878, in the Hearn home. One contemporary account specifies the scene as Miss Hearn's sitting room, and notes that Miss Duer called and met her there before the shooting. Another later synthesis places it in the entryway of the Hearn home and states the bullet lodged in Ella's upper jaw. The immediate aftermath is preserved in enough consistent fragments to let us understand the first crisis. Ella is wounded, bleeding, and still alive. A doctor is summoned. A household that had been ordinary that morning becomes a site of constant footfalls. Family members, neighbors, physicians, messengers, each arrival thickening the atmosphere of fear. One medical name is preserved clearly in the record, Dr. David Truitt, the Hearn family doctor, attended Ella during the illness that followed and chose not to remove the bullet. This decision mattered not only medically, but narratively. It meant that the wound was not an event that ended. It was a condition that remained inside her day after day, making recovery uncertain and suffering prolonged. It also meant the household remained a kind of vigil space, a home turned sick room. A contemporary account from December 1878 tells us something else crucial. Lillian Duer was not a stranger arriving for a single confrontation. She had been a familiar presence in the Hearn home. It states that she was a constant visitor at Mr. Hearn's residence, and that her manner toward Ella Hearn was of the most affectionate character. That line is loaded. It confirms that, even in the eyes of reporters writing with Victorian restraint, the attachment was intense enough to be remarked upon publicly. It also explains why the wound did not immediately end the relationship's gravity. When someone who has been constant suddenly becomes dangerous, a household does not merely treat it as crime. It treats it as betrayal. It treats it as the collapse of trust that had been allowed to settle into daily routine. Who visited during Ella's illness? The record we have does not preserve a complete visitor's ledger with time stamped beside names. We do not yet have an itemized list of every person who entered the Hearn home in November and December 1878. Those details are likely contained in deeper trial reporting, because court proceedings tend to preserve the names of those present on specific days and the people who heard certain statements. But we do have evidence of the categories of people who were present, and we have certain individuals named. We know medical attendance continued, and that Dr. Truitt was central. We know the Hearn family remained close around her. And we know that at least one of Ella's sisters was present during the early days after the shooting. Her sister's name, as preserved in trial testimony reported later, was Uisa Hearn. The spelling appears as printed. It may reflect reporting error or variant spelling. She testified that on the Saturday after the shooting, she saw Miss Duer in the bedroom, and she heard Ella speak to her. That single detail is a shock to a modern reader, because it means Lillian Duer was seen at the Hearn home again after the shooting, close enough to enter the bedroom where Ella lay. And Ella spoke to her. According to the same testimony, Ella said, "Lil, what did you do it for?" That moment is extraordinary not because it confirms motive. One sentence can't do that, but because it preserves the emotional and psychological reality of the week after violence. The offender is sometimes still within reach, still treated as someone who can be confronted, someone who can be questioned, someone who might respond with remorse or explanation. Families often do not snap cleanly into legal logic. In the immediate aftermath, they may still operate in the logic of relationship. Look what you have done to her. Look at her. Why? It also tells us something about the Hearn family's actions in those first days. If Lillian was present in the bedroom, the family had not yet placed her beyond the threshold entirely, or she found a way to return despite their horror. The record does not state precisely how this visit occurred, whether it was permitted, whether it was resisted, whether it was an act of contrition or an attempt to influence the story. What we can say is simply what the testimony preserves. She was there, and Ella addressed her. During this period, Lillian's own whereabouts are the hardest part to trace with absolute precision from the sources in hand, because the record shifts. She is present in the days immediately after the shooting, and then she flees. In later summaries of the case, her flight is described as dramatic. She cropped her hair, borrowed her brother's suit, and traveled disguised as a man, reportedly to Baltimore. Flight becomes a second story running beside the sickroom vigil. While Ella lay wounded, the town's attention would have split, some tracking the slow updates from the Hearn house, others tracking rumors of where Lillian had gone and how she had gone. A girl in a man's clothing on a train was the kind of detail the 19th century press could not resist. It turned an already sensational case into something stranger, a story about intimacy, violence, and disguise. But back in the Hearn home, the days continued. Ella's survival did not bring peace. It brought uncertainty. Because as long as Ella lived, the case could be framed differently by different people. If she recovered, the story might be treated as a terrible accident. If she died, the story would become homicide. In the meantime, the town could argue about what it wanted to believe. This is where the press enters like a second set of eyes, sharpening the story into narrative. By mid-December, a Baltimore Dispatch reported that both girls moved in the highest social circles, were pretty and well-educated, and that Lillian's attachment was of the most ardent nature. That language is not neutral. It is the press preparing its readers for the idea that motive lay inside devotion itself, that what looked like affection might have contained obsession. Then the month ends. Ella died on a Friday afternoon. One report states she died at about 3 o'clock. This is one of the rare moments in the record where time is pinned down precisely, Not merely a date, but an hour. The machinery of official response followed quickly. On the Saturday after her death, an acting coroner named Joseph L. Knox summoned the coroner's inquest. They adjourned and reconvened on Tuesday evening, when the jury returned its verdict. Another printed verdict states that the coroner's jury found Duer-Hearn came to her death from nervous depression caused by a ball shot from a pistol in the hand of Miss Lillian Duer at Pocomoke City on November 5, 1878. These phrases, nervous depression, nervous prostration, excited by the ball, are the 19th century struggling to describe what modern readers would recognize as trauma and bodily collapse following a gunshot wound. The terminology is archaic. The meaning is not. Ella died because she had been shot. After her death, the coroner's jury was convened at Duer-Hearn's request. Several doctors conducted an autopsy. The jury heard testimony from members of the Hearn family, from Lillian Duer, and from caretakers who had attended Ella. With that, the case left the realm of rumor and entered the machinery of the state. This was the moment the town's careful fictions began to collapse. For years, Pocomoke had contained the girls' relationship by treating it as an eccentricity. It had allowed itself not to look too closely, not to ask what the intimacy meant, not to admit what the bond might have been. After the shooting, the town tried the same tactic with the violence. It tried to soften it into accident, into misfortune, into a horrible mistake committed by a girl who could not possibly have meant it. But the evidence refused softness. Ella's body refused it. The coroner's verdict refused it. The lodged bullet refused it. The doctor's testimony refused it. And Duer-Hearn's insistence on formal inquiry refused it. The doorway became more than the site of a shooting. It became the threshold where intimacy turned into evidence, where devotion became motive, where a private bond became a matter for the law. In the weeks that followed, the case gathered a second life in the press, described as strange, sensational, and scandalous. The language of strange developments appears early, signaling what newspapers could not quite say plainly, that the relationship at the heart of the case made the violence both irresistible to print and difficult to name. And that is why the month matters. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was slow. A domestic place made into a vigil. A family watching their daughter fade. A town watching and choosing what to believe. A girl who had once been a constant visitor becoming a fugitive. A relationship transformed into legal record. Chapter 8. A town like Pocomoke City does not easily accept the idea that one of its own could be a fugitive. A scandal, yes. A tragedy, yes. A young woman's unfortunate act, yes. Anything that could be contained within the familiar language of mistake and sorrow. But a fugitive is different. A fugitive is a person who understands the law is coming and chooses to run anyway. A fugitive is intention made visible. And that is what Lillian Duer became. The details of her flight have survived because they were, to the 19th century imagination, as shocking as the shooting itself. Not because running was rare, but because the way she ran struck at multiple taboos at once. A young woman fleeing after another young woman was shot. A respectable girl turning herself into something the town could barely name. The disguise. Here is what we can say without embroidery. After the shooting, Lillian did not remain quietly in town to be arrested in the ordinary way. At some point in the weeks following November 5th, after the initial crisis, and before the machinery of the homicide case locked into place, she fled. Reports and later summaries consistently state that she cut her hair short, borrowed or used a man's suit, often described as her brother's, and traveled disguised as a man. The destination most often named is Baltimore. The exact day and hour of departure is not preserved in the material we have in hand. That is one of the frustrations of this case. Some parts are vivid, almost cinematic. Others are blurred, as though the paper itself flinched. But the shape of the escape remains clear. She altered her appearance. She chose clothing that would allow her to move through public spaces without being read as herself. And she used the rail system, the same arteries that carried tourists and merchants, to carry herself out of the town's reach. The disguise was practical. It would have protected her from immediate recognition, and it would have made travel simpler in an era when women alone were more conspicuous than men. But it also had a deeper significance that the press could not resist. A woman wearing men's clothes was already transgressive in the 19th century. A woman wearing men's clothes to flee after a shooting was irresistible. It turned a local case into national copy. This is where the story acquires its second center: the sickroom and the search. While Duer-Hearn lay wounded in her father's house, attended by her doctor and family, the town's attention would have split, half fixed on the slow updates from a Hearn home, half fixed on rumors of where Lillian had gone. In small places, People do not need official bulletins to begin tracking. They track through family networks, through local loyalties, through whose cousin saw what, through who noticed a stranger at the station, through who heard that a girl's hair had been cut. Because hair matters in a town like that. A young woman's hair is part of how she is known. Cutting it short is not a casual act. It is a signal of urgency. It is also the most immediate way to sever the recognizable self. It is one of the details that makes the flight feel deliberate rather than panicked. If you are in pure panic, you run as you are. If you cut your hair, source a suit, and travel by train under a changed appearance, you are doing something else. You are planning. And planning implies a mind working under pressure, making choices, weighing risk, deciding how best to remain free. Baltimore, if that was indeed her immediate destination, would have offered the anonymity that Pocomoke City could not. It was a city with crowds, with transit, with hotels, with the possibility of becoming a stranger again. A girl who stood out in a small town could dissolve into a city. But dissolving into a city is not the same as disappearing entirely. This is the part of the story that often becomes myth in retellings, the dramatic chase, the cunning disguise, the clever escape. In truth, what we can verify is that the disguise was reported, and that the destination was reported, but the day-by-day movements of her flight remain largely absent from the sources currently in hand. We do not yet have the names of those who helped her, if anyone did. We do not yet have documentation of where she stayed. We do not yet have the text of telegrams or warrants, if they were issued in those first days. That level of detail tends to appear in daily trial reporting. Witnesses describing what they saw, officers describing when they received information, locals describing when the accused vanished, how they learned it, what was said at the station, what rumors ran through the town like fever. For now, we hold to what we can say with confidence. She fled. She disguised herself as a man to do it. And the act of disguise did something important. It rearranged how the public understood her. It turned her from a strange, devoted girl into a figure of calculation. Someone capable of transformation. Someone who knew how to exploit social assumptions about gender to buy herself time. It is tempting to treat this as a separate story from the violence, an adventure stitched onto tragedy. But it isn't separate. It is part of the same pattern. A person who uses intimidation inside a relationship is already practicing a kind of control. A person who uses disguise to flee is practicing another kind of control. In both cases, the goal is the same: to shape the environment, to make reality bend. The disguise also sharpened the case's underlying unease. The way gender and intimacy were already tangled at the heart of the story. The newspapers could not name the relationship cleanly, and so they leaned into what they could name: clothing, hair, the shock of a girl in a man's suit. The disguise became a symbol of transgression that allowed the press to talk around the central taboo. The irony is that it was also simply the oldest fugitive strategy in the book. Change your appearance. Change your name if you can. Get out before the town decides what it believes. Because as long as Ella lived, the case could still be softened into accident. As long as Ella lived, no one was entirely sure what the law would do. But if Ella died, and every day of that long month made death more likely, the case would become murder. The stakes would change. The net would tighten. Lillian's flight sits inside that tightening. Whether she fled immediately or after days of uncertainty, the logic is the same. She understood the future was closing in. She understood that if Ella died, the word murder would attach itself to her name in a way that could not be brushed away by tears or claims of accident. So she ran. And by running, she created the condition for the next stage of the case: capture, return, and trial. Chapter 9. A town can tolerate uncertainty for only so long. While Ella Hearn lived, the story hovered in that awful in-between space where people could still pretend it might end neatly. An accident, they could say. A terrible misunderstanding. A girl's reckless moment. Something tragic, but not criminal. But when Ella died, the narrative hardened. Death has a way of forcing language to become specific. It forces the state to decide whether it is looking at misfortune or homicide. It forces families to stop whispering and begin demanding. It forces a community to confront what it would rather smooth over. Ella died on a Friday afternoon, reported as around 3 o'clock. That detail matters because it reminds you she died in the middle of the day, not in the secrecy of night. A life ending not with drama, but with hours passing, breath thinning, the slow exhaustion of a body trying and failing to recover from a gunshot wound. A death that happened while the town was awake. The official response began immediately. An acting coroner, Joseph L. Knock, summoned a coroner's inquest. The inquest adjourned and reconvened several days later on a Tuesday evening, when the jury returned its verdict. The process was both clinical and deeply political. A group of men, guided by doctors' testimony, deciding how to name the cause of death, and in doing so deciding how the law would speak about the girl who fired the shot. The language preserved in the reporting is Victorian in its restraint. The jury found that Duer-Hearn came to her death from nervous depression caused by a ball shot from a pistol in the hand of Miss Lillian Duer at Pocomoke City on November 5, 1878. It sounds almost gentle, doesn't it? Nervous depression, as though the body simply surrendered from sadness. But the verdict does not hide the essential fact. It ties the death back to the gun, and it ties the gun back to Lillian's hand. After the inquest came the next shift, responsibility becoming charge. This is where Jason Hearn's role becomes particularly important. He did not allow the case to be packaged as unfortunate romance or youthful drama. He pressed for procedure. He pressed for accountability. After his daughter's death, he pushed the authorities to summon the coroner's jury. The inquest, the autopsy, and the verdict made it difficult for the town to remain in denial. The case was moving into the hands of the state. At this stage, the popular story often begins to drift. Retelling sometimes jumps straight from the inquest to the courtroom, as though the world simply snapped from grief to trial in a single step. In reality, there was a slow tightening: warrants, legal preparation, the gathering of witnesses, the building of a prosecutable narrative out of a relationship that the culture could barely describe. This is also where Lillian's flight, the disguise, the departure, the rumors of Baltimore, becomes more than scandal. It becomes evidence of consciousness of guilt in the eyes of the public. Flight is not proof of intention, but it changes the emotional climate. It makes people ask, if it was truly an accident, why run? If it was a terrible mistake, why cut your hair, borrow a suit, and disappear? The law would eventually have to answer those questions with something more than sentiment. An indictment followed. Lillian Duer was charged with murder. By the time the case reached the courtroom, it would be tried not as mere misfortune, but as homicide. It would be staged in a setting that could bear the weight of public attention. Snow Hill, the county seat, where the trial could unfold under the formal authority of the court. Snow Hill matters for more than geography. It matters because it signals the case leaving the intimate scale of Pocomoke gossip and entering the wider theater of law. The courtroom does not care how close the girls once were. It does not care how strange or tender the relationship appeared in daylight. It cares about acts, evidence, credibility, and whether those acts fit the legal definitions of murder, manslaughter, accident. But the courtroom was never neutral. It carried the biases of its era like dust in the woodwork. It carried the Victorian insistence that women were delicate. It carried the reluctance to see female violence as deliberate. It carried, too, the discomfort of describing a relationship between women. All of that would shape how testimony was interpreted and how the final verdict was made. Even before the trial began, the way the authorities handled Lillian hinted at those biases. Instead of being kept in a jail cell like a typical accused murderer, she was lodged at the National Hotel across from the courthouse. The sheriff is reported to have said that jail was no fit place for a young woman. That single detail reveals the deep undercurrent of the case. The law, even as it prepared to try her for murder, still saw her through the lens of femininity. She was not merely an accused killer. She was a girl, a young lady, a person to be protected from the harshness of prison, even while being prosecuted for causing a death. It is hard to imagine a male defendant receiving the same courtesy. And then the case became a gathering point. Trials in small county seats were not merely legal proceedings. They were events. People traveled. People crowded in. They came to see the faces. They came to hear the details. They came to decide what they believed, and to watch the court decide alongside them. In this case, the crowd came for more than murder. They came for the relationship, even if they could not call it by its name. They came for the scandalous intimacy, the masculine clothing, the jealousy narrative, the idea of a love so ardent it could become lethal. They came to watch the law attempt to place that kind of love inside a framework designed for husbands and wives, for men and women, for ordinary domestic violence, not for something that disturbed the era's categories. And because the case could not be spoken about plainly, the reporting often leaned harder into what could be described without moral panic: education, social standing, prettiness, youth. The press was careful to reassure readers that these were not low people. They were respectable. They were educated. They moved in good circles. And that respectability made the violence both more scandalous and, paradoxically, easier for some to excuse. This is where the case becomes truly chilling. Because once a community begins to excuse violence based on the offender's social position, The victim becomes less important than the story the community wants to tell about itself. Ella becomes, in that moment, not simply a dead girl, but a problem, a tragedy that threatens to stain the town's self-image and to expose something it would rather keep folded into silence. The trial in Snow Hill would therefore become a battleground, not only over what happened in the Hearn home, but over what kind of relationship the town was willing to admit existed between the girls. The law would hear testimony, the press would frame it, the public would interpret it, and through it all, the central fact could not be undone. Ella Hearn was dead. A coroner's jury had tied her death to a ball shot from a pistol in Lillian Duer's hand. The case was no longer a whisper. It was a murder charge. Chapter 10. Snow Hill in late May was not a place built for discretion. It was a county seat, accustomed to court days, accustomed to men riding in from outlying towns, accustomed to the stiff rituals of law. But there are cases that change the texture of a courthouse. They pull the ordinary crowd tighter. They make people arrive early. They make them lean forward, hungry for details that will confirm whatever they already believe. This was one of those cases. When the trial opened on May 29, 1879, it did not open only for the court. It opened for the region. It opened for the newspapers. It opened for anyone who had heard of two educated girls from Pocomoke City, pretty, well-bred, and inseparable, whose story had ended with a gunshot and a slow death. The courthouse could not hold the full weight of that curiosity, but it absorbed it anyway. People pressed into the space, men and women alike. Some came out of moral outrage. Some came out of morbid fascination. Some came because they had watched the girls walk together in Pocomoke and could not reconcile those images with the language of murder. And some came because the case carried a deeper charge, the kind no one could say plainly. The idea of love between women, and what the world might do when it was forced into the light. In a case like this, the trial does not begin with emotion. It begins with procedure. An indictment is read. The charge is named. The defendant appears as a body in a chair. The law insists on clear categories even when the human story resists them. Lillian Duer entered that courtroom not from a jail cell, but from a hotel room. She was lodged at the National Hotel across from the courthouse, a decision made by the sheriff on the grounds that jail was no fit place for a young woman. That detail might seem small, but it set the tone. Even before a word of testimony was heard, she was being treated with a softness that revealed the era's bias. A man accused of shooting someone in their home would not have been granted the same courtesy. It is worth lingering on what that would have meant in practical terms. She was not behind bars. She was not among hardened offenders. She was in a hotel, clean linen, a door that locked, the strange comfort of respectability preserved even as she faced a murder charge. It was not freedom, but it was not the full brutality of incarceration either. It was a kind of liminal state, a place between the girl she had been and the criminal she might be declared to be. When she entered the courtroom, she would have been read not only as a defendant, but as a symbol. Newspapers had already described her as attractive, well-educated, socially elevated. She was not meant to look like a murderer. That fact alone would have shaped every glance in the room. The prosecution's task was simple in theory and complex in practice. To convince the court that the shooting was not an accident, and that the death of Ella Hearn could be laid at Lillian's feet in the language of law. The defense's task was equally clear: to pull the story back into accident, into misfortune, into a moment of careless handling. To insist that whatever intimacy existed between the girls, whatever jealousy might have flared, did not amount to intent. The defense would have known what they were working with. An era that wanted to believe women were not capable of cold-blooded violence, and an era reluctant to acknowledge a relationship between women as romantic in the first place. This meant the defense could lean into the very things that made the case sensational. They could make her youth and sex into armor. They could appeal to delicacy. They could present the story as tragedy, not malice. The prosecution, meanwhile, had to cut through those soft narratives and keep the focus on one immovable fact. Ella was shot. She died. The coroner's jury had returned a verdict tying her death back to the pistol in Lillian's hand. But even the coroner's language could be exploited. Nervous depression. Nervous prostration. Those phrases, strange and gentle to the modern ear, could be used to muddy the waters. Did she die because of the wound? Did she die because of nervous shock? Did she die because of medical complications? Could the defense suggest that doctors' decisions contributed, that the bullet's removal was too risky, that the cause of death was not straightforward? Trials are not merely about truth. They are about the story the jury is prepared to accept. This is why witness testimony mattered so much. Not only what witnesses said, but who they were. In a case involving two respectable young women, The witnesses were not only neighbors and passers-by. They were family members. They were doctors. They were caretakers. They were people with reputations, people the jury might respect, people whose words would be weighed against the instinct to protect a young woman from the full consequences of law. It is in the testimony that the intimacy became unavoidable. Even if the court did not call it romance, the relationship would have to be described. The jury needed to understand the nature of the bond to understand the motive the prosecution suggested. The defense needed to soften it into excessive friendship, to avoid the implications of jealousy as romantic possession. This is the quiet violence of the courtroom. It translates human life into acceptable categories. Ella's father, Duer-Hearn, was central in the aftermath of his daughter's death, and his presence would have hung over the trial even when he was not speaking. This was his child, his home, his insistence that the case be treated seriously, his request for an inquest. A father's grief turned into legal action, and then there were the medical voices. Dr. David Truitt, the family physician who attended Ella and chose not to remove the bullet, became part of the story because medicine and law are intertwined in homicide cases. If the defense could suggest that Ella's death was not directly caused by the gunshot, but by shock, or by medical decisions, or by complications that were not inevitable, they could attempt to dilute Lillian's culpability. This is the kind of argument juries find seductive because it gives them permission to feel merciful. But the prosecution would have returned, again and again, to the core. The wound originated with the pistol in Lillian's hand. Among the testimonies that survive in later reporting is one that still catches in the throat. Ella's sister, recorded in one account as Duer-Hearn, said that she saw Lillian in the bedroom on the Saturday after the shooting and heard Ella address her. "Lil, what did you do it for?" That sentence is not a legal argument. It is a human one. It is the voice of a dying girl asking for meaning. And in a courtroom, meaning is everything. Because if Ella believed, even in sickness, that she had been shot intentionally, that belief could shape how witnesses spoke about motive. It could shape how jurors interpreted Lillian's actions. It could shape whether the act was seen as accident or as choice. The defense, of course, would attempt to take the sting from that sentence. They would argue that a dying girl's words were not proof of intent. They would argue she was confused, frightened, influenced by others. They would insist that the only truth lay in the physical act, that the pistol discharged accidentally while being examined or handled. This is where the trial becomes a theater of competing moral realities. In one reality, Lillian is a young woman overcome by jealousy, using a weapon to enforce possession, and then fleeing. In the other, she is a careless girl caught in a terrible accident, rendered helpless by the consequences, weeping, begging for a doctor, then running not from guilt but from terror and shame. Both realities rely on the same facts. Both attempt to dominate the interpretation. And while the court argued, the public watched. The trial did not exist in isolation. Reporters turned testimony into headlines. Readers consumed the story as entertainment. The relationship between the girls, the thing the law could not comfortably articulate, became the unspoken hook that pulled the country's attention. People followed the case not only to see whether a girl would be punished, but to see how the court would handle the scandal at its center. Because the scandal was not simply the shooting. The scandal was that the relationship could not be neatly contained by 19th century notions of girlhood. That scandal hovered over every witness. It hovered over every argument. It hovered over the jury, who had to decide not only what happened in the Hearn home, but what kind of love could create such violence. The first days of trial are always a tightening. The court sets the stage, the lawyers establish their narratives, and the witnesses begin to speak. Each testimony is a thread, and the jury slowly weaves those threads into the story they will carry into deliberation. By the end of this trial, Lillian Duer would not be judged only for a gunshot. She would be judged for a relationship. And that is why the verdict, when it came, would shock so many. Chapter 11. A trial is a machine built to reduce chaos into narrative. It takes a life, messy, private, full of contradictory emotions, and forces it into a sequence of questions with yes or no answers. It is designed to extract fact, but it is also designed to produce certainty. And certainty is exactly what this case refused to give. Because the courtroom was not only trying to determine what happened in the Hearn home, it was trying to determine what the relationship meant. In Snow Hill, the bond between Ella Hearn and Lillian Duer became an object passed from witness to witness like evidence. People described what they had seen, the closeness, the devotion, the constancy. They described how often Lillian visited the Hearn home, how affectionate her manner was. They described the kind of attachment that, in another era, might have been called love without hesitation. But this was not another era. So the language faltered. It circled. It leaned on euphemism. It called a relationship intimacy and attachment. It suggested infatuation. It implied without naming. The courtroom needed motive without having to admit the kind of motive it was. And when love is treated as unspeakable, it becomes easier to distort. This is how the testimony split into two opposing portraits of Lillian Duer. In one portrait, she was a devoted girl driven to desperation by jealousy. Her emotional attachment was portrayed as intense, possibly obsessive, and threatened by the presence of another girl, Ella Foster, whose name entered the case as the spark that ignited the final confrontation. In this portrait, the gun was not an accident. It was an escalation of a pattern. Jealousy tightening into control, control sharpening into threat. In the other portrait, she was a careless, emotional, perhaps eccentric young woman who never intended to harm anyone. In this portrait, the gunshot was a catastrophic mistake, a pistol examined or handled in a moment of foolishness, discharging at the worst possible time. Tears were offered as proof. Her youth was used as armor. Her femininity was made into a kind of defense. Both portraits leaned on facts. Both were shaped by what the jury wanted to believe about women. The defense understood that. The defense understood that juries were reluctant to send young women to prison, especially women from respectable families. The defense understood that the accused had not been dragged into court in chains from a filthy cell. She had been kept across the road in a hotel, because the sheriff said jail was no fit place for a young lady. That decision didn't just protect her body, it protected her image. And image mattered. If the defendant could be kept looking like a young lady, she could be kept within the sphere of sympathy. Sympathy is not a legal argument, but it is often the strongest force in a jury room. This is why the medical testimony mattered so much. Because the defense had a potential doorway to doubt. Ella Hearn did not die immediately. She died weeks later. The coroner's language referred to nervous depression and nervous prostration, phrases that could be interpreted in multiple ways. The defense could suggest that the death was not the direct, inevitable result of the gunshot. They could question whether the wound itself was fatal. They could draw attention to the decision not to remove the bullet. They could hint that medicine, not malice, might share the blame. This is a classic defense strategy in cases involving delayed death. If you can introduce uncertainty about causation, you can soften culpability. And softening culpability creates a path away from murder. The prosecution's job was to keep the court anchored. They would have returned again and again to the essential chain. A pistol in Lillian Duer's hand. A shot fired on November 5, 1878. A wound inflicted on Ella Hearn. A month of decline. A death. A coroner's verdict tying the death back to the ball fired from that pistol. The prosecution likely understood that their real battle was not only legal but cultural. They were fighting against the era's deep belief that women did not kill the way men killed. They were fighting against the tendency to treat women's violence as accidental by default. So they needed not only facts, but feeling. They needed the jury to see Ella as a person. This is where the testimony of family became devastating. A sister testified that on the Saturday after the shooting, she saw Lillian in the bedroom and heard Ella speak to her. Ella's words were preserved in that testimony like a wound that never healed. "Lil, what did you do it for?" The sentence is small, but it changes the air in a courtroom. Because it contains accusation. It contains confusion. It contains a dying girl asking for meaning from the person who harmed her. It is not the language of accident. It is the language of betrayal. The defense could argue that a dying girl's words are not proof of intent. They could argue she was frightened, influenced, in pain, not thinking clearly. But they could not erase the emotional power of the question. A jury can forgive an accident. It struggles to forgive a question like that. And then there was the matter of flight. The defense would have tried to frame Lillian's escape as panic, fear of scandal, fear of arrest, fear of community judgment. They might have framed the male disguise as theatrical, but not incriminating, an act of desperation rather than calculation. But the prosecution would have pressed the obvious point. Innocent people do not usually cut their hair, borrow a suit, and flee as a man. Flight is not proof. But in the human mind, it often feels like confession. The jurors would have heard testimony about the relationship, about jealousy, about the gun, about the shooting, about the slow death, about the inquest, about the coroner's conclusion. They would have heard arguments about accident versus intent, about whether Ella's death was inevitable, about whether Lillian's behavior before and after the shooting suggested culpability. And through it all, one extraordinary tension would have remained in the room, vibrating beneath the formal language. If the prosecution leaned too hard into romantic motive, they risked forcing the courtroom to confront the nature of the relationship openly. A risky strategy in an era that could recoil from such openness. If the defense leaned too hard into mere friendship, they risked losing the explanation that made the violence make sense at all. So the case hovered in euphemism. And euphemism has consequences. Euphemism does not only obscure love, it obscures violence. It makes a possessive relationship sound like a harmless attachment. It makes a controlling dynamic sound like youthful jealousy. It makes warning shots sound like drama. It makes a domestic killing sound like misfortune. This is how a courtroom can be steered toward mercy. In the end, the jury was asked to choose between two realities. Either Lillian Duer intentionally shot Duer-Hearn in a moment of jealousy and control, and her flight confirmed her awareness of guilt, or the pistol discharged accidentally, and everything that followed was a tragic unfolding no one could reverse. The jury's decision would show which story they found easier to live with. Because verdicts are never only about evidence. They are also about what society can bear to admit. And what this society could not bear to admit, fully plainly, was that a young woman might kill another young woman not in madness, not an accident, but in the same grim emotional logic that has driven intimate violence for centuries. Possession, jealousy, and the refusal to let go. Chapter 12. The verdict arrived the way verdicts always arrive. Through a doorway. Not the doorway of a home, not a doorway stained with blood, but the doorway of a jury room. A line crossed. A decision carried back into the open. A handful of words that would decide what the world was permitted to call what happened to Duer-Hearn. By the time the jury withdrew, the case had already been fought in every register available to the 19th century. It had been fought as scandal. It had been fought as tragedy. It had been fought as accident. It had been fought, quietly, as a story about a relationship that could not be described without moral panic. And it had been fought as a murder trial, with all the machinery of the state insisting that a death demands a name, and a name demands a penalty. Then the jury returned. Not with murder, not with acquittal, but with something in between, manslaughter. It is hard, in modern terms, to explain the emotional violence contained in that middle category. Manslaughter is the law's compromise. It is the verdict that says, yes, she killed, but not with the kind of intention we are willing to name as murder. It is culpability softened. It is a life taken, and a life spared full punishment. In the Duer case, the compromise became even more stark. Because the punishment was a fine. $500. No prison sentence. No hard labor. No years behind walls. A girl was dead, and the law responded with a sum of money and a closing of files. The moment the sentence was reported, it became part of the story's legend. The sheriff saying jail was no fit place for a young lady. The court treating the defendant as someone still deserving protection, even after another young woman had died from a ball fired from her pistol. It is possible to read the outcome as mercy. It is also possible to read it as a quiet declaration that Ella's life was worth less than the discomfort of imprisoning a respectable girl. To understand how a jury could arrive there, you have to understand what they were being asked to hold. They were being asked to condemn one young woman as a killer while still living in a culture that resisted the idea of women as intentional perpetrators. They were being asked to treat a private relationship as evidence while living in a culture that did not have the language to describe that relationship openly. They were being asked to decide whether a gunshot was accident or choice, while knowing that the victim did not die immediately, and the medical narrative could be complicated. Manslaughter allowed them to avoid the sharpest truth. Manslaughter allowed them to believe in tragedy rather than intent. And a fine allowed them to finish the case without the spectacle of a young woman behind bars. This is not to say the decision was simply corruption or sentimentality. Juries are not always monsters. They are often ordinary people struggling with the limits of what they can imagine. But that struggle is exactly what makes the verdict so unsettling. Because there is nothing ordinary about the facts as they were preserved. A girl shot in her father's house, a wound that lingered, an inquest, a death, a flight in disguise, a trial crowded with the tension of unspeakable intimacy, and finally a legal outcome that allowed the accused to return to life after paying money. It is difficult not to feel the weight of what that meant for the Hearn family. Jason Hearn had demanded formal inquiry. He had pushed for the case to be treated seriously. He had watched his daughter suffer, then watched her die. He had watched doctors weigh her condition. He had sat in the knowledge that the person responsible had been a constant visitor in his home, someone whose affection had been visible and apparently welcomed. And then he watched a jury name the killing as manslaughter and translate his daughter's death into a fine. $500 did not bring back a child. $500 did not restore the house to innocence. $500 did not undo the way the town would remember the family and their dead girl. But the law was not built to restore innocence. It was built to close cases. The verdict did not end the story. It shifted it. Because once a jury chooses manslaughter, the public begins to reinterpret everything. People begin to ask whether the victim was partly responsible, whether the relationship itself was the problem, whether the death was inevitable, whether the accused should be pitted, whether the case was really a crime at all, or merely the tragic result of excessive emotion. This is how victims are buried twice, once in the ground and once beneath narrative. In the weeks and years after the trial, the case would continue to circulate, retold with emphasis on the strangest parts, the devotion, the jealousy, the disguise, often at the expense of the most brutal fact. Duer-Hearn died. And the law, in the end, did not treat that death as something requiring full punishment. This is why the verdict feels like a second wound. Because the verdict did not simply decide what Lillian Duer would endure. It decided what Duer-Hearn's death would mean. It decided, in effect, that the killing could be folded into the category of misfortune, and that a respectable young woman could be spared the full consequence of her act. If you are searching for a clean moral ending, you will not find it here. The 19th century rarely delivered them, especially in cases where gender, class, and taboo intimacy collided. When those forces collide, the law often bends. And it bent here. Chapter 13. A verdict does not end a case. It only ends the court's responsibility for it. After the judge's words, after the fine was set, after the crowd began to spill back into the street with their opinions sharpened into certainty, the real work of living began. The Hearn family went home without their daughter. The town returned to its routines with a murder case folded into its memory, like a stain that could not be scrubbed out. And Lillian Duer, convicted, fined, and spared imprisonment, did what many defendants do after the law has finished with them. She disappeared. Not in the dramatic way she had disappeared when she fled in disguise, but in the quieter way that history allows certain people to vanish. The kind of disappearance that happens when the record loses interest, when newspapers move on, when a community stops talking loudly enough for it to be preserved. The law, satisfied with its compromise, did not keep her pinned to the page the way it pins murderers in more sensational cases. What remained was not a clear account of her later life, but the silhouette she left behind. A young woman from a respectable family, associated forever with a dead girl's name, the story retold and retold until it hardened into legend. This is one of the cruelest features of true crime from this era. The offender is often granted the gift of obscurity, while the victim is fixed in permanence. The living have the chance to become something else. The dead are trapped inside their last chapter. Duer-Hearn had no such escape. She remained the girl who died after being shot in her father's home. In the public imagination, she became a figure of tragedy, her name attached to the scandal and not to the ordinary life she had lived before it. Her education, her friendships, her daily walks, her hopes, those details were swallowed. The story of her became a story about what happened to her. For Jason Hearn, grief would have been complicated by rage. He had done what a father could do within the limits of his time. He had pushed for an inquest, demanded liability be formally examined, and watched the case travel to trial. But the outcome offered no satisfaction that a parent could recognize. A fine is not justice in the emotional sense. A fine is an administrative closure. It is a line drawn under a death as though the world can balance a life with money. It is easy, from a distance, to wonder why the verdict was so lenient. To see it as failure, as cowardice, as class privilege, as sexism. All of those forces were likely present. But it is also important to see the deeper cultural mechanics at work. The jury was not only judging a gunshot, it was judging a relationship. And the 19th century was deeply invested in making that relationship something it could live with. If the jury had convicted her of murder and sent her to prison, they would have had to name the motive as something more than careless accident. They would have had to accept the possibility of intentional violence born of romantic jealousy between women. They would have had to accept that female intimacy could be as consuming, as possessive, and as dangerous as any heterosexual domestic drama. The law could do that. Society did not want to. So the verdict created a story the town could bear. An accident, a tragedy, a moment of misguided emotion. Manslaughter is not innocence, but it is a softened guilt. It is the option that allows people to condemn without confronting the full horror of intention. And then the fine did what fines always do. It made the harm feel containable. It turned a death into a sum. This is why the aftermath of the case is as revealing as the trial itself. because in the aftermath you see what a community chooses to remember. Newspapers continue to refer to the strange nature of the relationship, the unusual closeness, the intensity. They continued to find the details they could safely print, the education, the social standing, the prettiness, the disguise. The male clothing became a kind of shorthand, an image that allowed readers to feel scandal without acknowledging the deeper intimacy. It is a familiar pattern. When society cannot name love between women, it names everything around it instead. It describes the hair, the clothes, the walks, the devotion, the jealousy, the eccentricity. It treats the relationship like a curiosity rather than a bond. And because it does that, it becomes easier to treat the violence like a curiosity too. But the violence was not curious. It was intimate and fatal. The case also left behind a quiet warning about what happens when early violence is dismissed. The October incident in the woods, shots fired to frighten, should have ended the relationship. It should have prompted separation, intervention, alarm. Instead, it became part of the relationship's private mythology, folded into it like a threat that could be endured. This is how coercive dynamics survive. The warning is minimized, the danger is normalized, and by the time the violence becomes undeniable, it is too late. The question the aftermath forces on the reader is not simply, why did she do it? It is, why was she allowed to get away with so little consequence? Why was a young woman in male disguise on a train treated as a sensational detail rather than evidence of desperate flight? Why was the death of a young woman translated into nervous depression rather than spoken plainly as a fatal gunshot wound? Why did the law decide that a fine was sufficient? The answers lie in the intersection of class, gender, and taboo. A respectable family could cushion a respectable girl. A jury could feel paternalistic toward a young lady. A community uncomfortable with queer intimacy could prefer the story that made the relationship itself the tragedy rather than the violence that grew from it. And in that preference, the victim could become a symbol rather than a person. This is what the case left behind. Not just a verdict, but a template for misunderstanding. It left behind the idea that female violence is always accidental, always emotional, always less serious. It left behind the idea that love between women is either harmless sweetness or bizarre pathology. Anything but real love with real stakes. It left behind, too, the deeply unsettling reality that domestic violence can be hidden in plain sight when society is invested in not seeing it. For the Hearn family, the aftermath would have been lived in the small, brutal ways that no newspaper records. The empty chair, the unused clothing, the house that never fully feels safe again, the way every mention of Lillian's name would have struck like a bruise. The town would have moved on, but the family would not have had that luxury. And Lillian, she would have lived with her own consequences, whatever form they took. But history does not preserve them with the same fidelity, it preserves the spectacle of the trial. That absence is itself revealing. The world is often more interested in the moment of scandal than in the long life that follows it. Ella Hearn remains the center because she is the one who cannot speak beyond the record. She remains the one who cannot recast herself. She remains the one who cannot be redeemed by time. And yet, even in death, she exerts a kind of power over the story. Her name anchors it. Her suffering forces the reader to remember that behind every courtroom compromise is a body that paid the full cost. The aftermath of this case is not neat. It is not satisfying. It is a reminder that justice is often shaped not by truth alone, but by what society is willing to see. And in this story, what society most struggled to see was not simply female violence. It was the kind of love that made the violence make sense. Conclusion. The case of Lillian Duer is often remembered for its strangest details. A girl in a man's suit. A train to Baltimore. A relationship the newspapers could not name. A courtroom filled with curiosity, half scandal and half fascination. A verdict that felt like mercy to some and like a second death to others. Those are the details that survive because they are easy to repeat. They glitter with the sensational sheen that history loves. They let a reader feel close to the shock of it without having to sit with the harder thing beneath. But the case was not, at its core, a scandal. It was a domestic violence case. It was a relationship that grew into something possessive and controlling. It was intimidation disguised as emotion. It was escalation rehearsed in the woods, where shots were fired to frighten, and then made irreversible in a domestic doorway. It was a young woman shot in her father's home, a slow month of suffering, and a death that forced the state to decide how much a life was worth. This is what makes the case so chilling. Its familiarity. Strip away the Victorian euphemisms, and the pattern is one we still recognize. The controlling partner. The fear of abandonment. the jealousy that demands proof, the threat that becomes a weapon, the moments when the victim's independence is treated as betrayal, the escalation that the community minimizes until it is too late. The 19th century did not have language for coercive control, but the behavior was already there. The 19th century did not have language for a queer relationship that could be described without moral panic, but the relationship was already there too. Lived in daylight, hand in hand, visible enough that people in town noticed. And that visibility is part of what makes the outcome so difficult to accept. Because the case reveals not only what can happen between two people, but what a society will do when it is confronted with something it cannot comfortably name. Victorian America struggled with two facts at once. Women could love women, and women could harm women. To admit the first was to admit a form of intimacy outside accepted boundaries. To admit the second was to admit female agency in its darkest form. So the culture reached for safer stories. It softened love into infatuation and eccentricity. It softened violence into accident, hysteria, emotional excess. It softened accountability into manslaughter and a fine. In doing so, it produced a version of the case that protected everyone except the girl who died. The legal compromise, manslaughter, $500, no prison, has haunted the case for a reason. It exposes the quiet arithmetic of class, gender, and respectability. Lillian Duer was not treated as a common criminal. She was treated as a young lady. She was housed in a hotel rather than in a cell. She was spared the kind of punishment that would have marked her forever. The law extended gentleness toward her even as it acknowledged, however partially, that her actions caused a death. This is one of the great cruelties of the system. It can condemn and protect at the same time. For the Hearn family, the verdict was not closure. It was a public announcement that the world's discomfort mattered more than their loss. That their daughter's life could be translated into money. That grief could be balanced with a fine and a shrug, and that the living would be allowed to move on. And what of Ella? Ella Hearn remains the only constant in the story, because she cannot rewrite herself. She cannot fade into obscurity. She cannot become someone else. She is held in history at the age she died, her identity reduced in the public mind to the moment she was shot and the months she lingered. The tragedy is that she had been more than the case. She had been a girl with an education, a girl with an inner life no reporter could fully capture, a girl whose relationship, whatever its nature in private, was significant enough to shape her days. The case leaves her mostly as a silhouette, visible only through other people's testimony and the cold language of inquest. But even as a silhouette, she is the moral center of the story, because her suffering is what strips the sensational shine from the case. A girl lay in a bedroom for weeks, attended by a doctor who could not, or would not, remove the bullet. Her father watched her fade. Her sister heard her ask, "Lil, what did you do it for?" That one sentence carries the grief of the entire case. It is the question no verdict answered, the question no fine could resolve. Why did you do it? Why did you decide fear was acceptable? Why did you turn love into possession? Why did you pull the trigger? The law never answered those questions. It only named the act in the least painful way it could tolerate. And perhaps that is the final truth. The case of Lillian Duer is not simply about a shooting. It is about a culture's refusal to face what the shooting meant. It is about the way a society that cannot name love will also struggle to name violence. It is about how the discomfort of witnesses, jurors, reporters, and readers can shape justice itself. It is also, in its darkest sense, about the way domestic violence hides behind respectability. Lillian Duer was not a stranger. She was a constant visitor. She was affectionate. She was familiar. And that familiarity helped her. It helped her be believed. It helped her be pitied. It helped her receive mercy. That is why this case still matters. Because it reveals how little protection familiarity provides, and how easily a community can overlook the warning signs when the people involved are educated, pretty, and good. The woods should have been a turning point. The first shots should have ended the relationship, and perhaps saved a life. But the warning was minimized, the danger normalized, and the pattern continued until it ended in an entryway. If there is a lesson in this story, it is not a tidy one. It is not love kills, as sensational headlines might prefer. It is simpler, and more brutal, control kills. Control kills slowly, by narrowing a victim's world. Control kills socially, by isolating the victim behind shame and silence. And sometimes, control kills physically, when the offender decides the victim's autonomy is intolerable. Ella Hearn's death was not inevitable. But once coercive control had been introduced, once fear had been used as a tool, the relationship became dangerous in a way the town did not recognize, or did not wish to recognize. This is why the story survives. Not because it is strange, but because it is familiar. Not because it is sensational, but because it is a warning. A case where the most shocking detail is not the disguise, not the whispers, not the scandal. The most shocking detail is the verdict. A girl died, and the world found a way to make it bearable. And that, perhaps, is the final crime. Appendixes. Appendix A, Verified Timeline, the Duer-Hearn case, 1878 to 1879. This timeline includes only events that can be anchored to the historical record as it exists in the sources used for this manuscript. Where the record does not preserve an exact day or time, the entry is listed with the highest confirmed precision available, month, week, or after/before. Before the crime, background events. Early, mid-1870s, approximate. Ella Hearn and Lillian Duer attend the same academy and are roommates. Both later graduate with honors. Exact academy name and dates not preserved in the accessible record used here. Circa 1874 to 1878, approximate. The Hearn family moves to Pocomoke City, reported as roughly 4 years before the shooting in later synthesis. Lillian and Ella are frequently seen together in town, often walking arm in arm or hand in hand. Exact move-in date and address not preserved in the accessible record used here. Escalation. October 1878, month confirmed, exact day not preserved. Woods incident. During a walk, Lillian fires multiple shots that narrowly miss Ella. Lillian later claims she only meant to frighten her. Exact date, location, and witnesses not preserved in the accessible record used here. The shooting. Tuesday, November 5, 1878. Shooting at the Hearn family home in Pocomoke City, Maryland. Ella Hearn is shot by Lillian Duer. Ella survives the initial wound. Immediately after the shooting, same day, exact time not preserved. A neighbor/passerby is reported to have heard the shot and scream and run inside. This person is not named in the sources currently used. A doctor is summoned. One physician later identified in the record is Dr. David Truitt, the Hearn family doctor. Saturday after the shooting, date depends on what is meant by Saturday after, but the testimony places it in the first week after November 5, 1878. Ella's sister, name preserved as Oisa Hearn in later reporting, testifies that she saw Lillian in Ella's bedroom and heard Ella say, "Lil, what did you do it for?" Exact calendar date, not preserved in the accessible record used here. The long month, illness plus flight. November 1878, exact day, not preserved. Dr. David Truitt attends Ella Hearn and chooses not to remove the bullet. Ella remains ill for weeks. November 1878, exact departure day, not preserved. Lillian Duer flees Pocomoke City. Later reporting and modern synthesis consistently describe her cutting her hair, using male attire, often described as her brother's suit, and traveling disguised as a man, reportedly to Baltimore. Ella's death. Friday, early December 1878, exact date preserved in some accounts, exact day not confirmed in every source used here. Ella Hearn dies after lingering for approximately 1 month following the shooting. Reported time of death, about 3 o'clock, afternoon. This is one of the few time-specific details preserved in the period reporting. Coroner's inquest plus verdict. Saturday after Ella's death, exact date not preserved. Acting Coroner Joseph L. Knox summons a coroner's inquest. Tuesday evening after the Saturday inquest, exact date not preserved. The coroner's jury reconvenes and returns a verdict. Coroner's jury verdict, date not fully fixed, but returned after death. The jury finds that Ella Hearn died from nervous depression, or similar phrasing in period reporting, caused by a ball shot from a pistol in the hand of Miss Lily Duer at Pocomoke City on November 5, 1878. Autopsy is reported as conducted by several doctors. Individual names not consistently preserved in the sources used here. Trial. Thursday, May 29, 1879. Trial begins in Snow Hill, Maryland. During trial period, May, June 1879. Lillian is lodged at the National Hotel across from the courthouse because the sheriff considers jail no fit place for a young woman. Verdict plus sentence. Thursday, June 19, 1879. Verdict delivered. Guilty of manslaughter. Sentence. Fine of $500. No prison sentence imposed. Post-trial. After June 1879. Lillian Duer's subsequent life and movements are not preserved with consistent clarity in the sources used for this manuscript. She fades from the public record compared to the sustained preservation of the case itself. Appendix B, Witness and Person Index, confirmed names only. This appendix lists individuals whose names are preserved in the sources used for this manuscript, with their verified role in the case. Where a person's exact testimony is not available in the current material, their involvement is described only as far as the record supports. Where the sources preserve a statement, it is included verbatim, short excerpts only. Where sources do not preserve a name, e.g., the neighbor, the person is not listed here and is instead flagged at the end as an unresolved identity requiring deeper trial reporting. 1. Ella Hearn. Role: victim. Known for: shot on November 5, 1878 at the Hearn family home in Pocomoke City, died approximately 1 month later. Recorded statement, as reported through witness testimony. Lil, what did you do it for? 2. Lillian, Lily/Lily, Duer. Role: accused/defendant. Known for: shot Ella Hearn on November 5, 1878. Later fled disguised as a man. Tried in Snow Hill in 1879. Convicted of manslaughter and fined. Reported involvement in inquest testimony. Appears as a named party whose act is referenced in the coroner's verdict. Reported to have been heard by the inquest after Ella's death. 3. Jason Hearn. Role: Ella Hearn's father. Key family figure in the aftermath. Known for: requesting formal action after Ella's death. Verified actions. Requested the town magistrate convene a coroner's jury following Ella's death. Disclosed information reported as coming from Ella, intentional shooting narrative, in accounts of the aftermath. Direct courtroom testimony and verbatim quotations are not preserved in the sources currently used for this manuscript, but his actions are clearly documented. 4. Owisa Hearn. Spelling as preserved in reporting. Role: Ella Hearn's sister, witness. Known for: providing a specific post-shooting observation used as evidence of Ella's perception of the act. Verified testimony, as reported. Stated she saw Lillian Duer in Ella's bedroom on the Saturday after the shooting. Stated she heard Ella say, "Lil, what did you do it for?" Note: the spelling Owisa may reflect reporting variation or error. It is retained here exactly as it appears in the record used. 5. Dr. David Truitt. Role: treating physician. Medical witness by implication through documented care. Known for: serving as the Hearn family doctor, attending Ella after the shooting. Verified involvement. Treated Ella during her illness. Chose not to remove the bullet due to perceived risk. Full medical testimony is not preserved in the sources currently used, but his documented role is confirmed. 6. Joseph L. Knock. Role: acting coroner, inquest official. Known for: convening the inquest after Ella Hearn's death. Verified involvement. Summoned the coroner's inquest on the Saturday following Ella's death. Oversaw the inquest process, which adjourned and reconvened on a Tuesday evening. 7. Coroner's jury. Names not preserved in current sources. Role: jury of inquiry, legal medical panel. Known for: returning the official verdict regarding cause of death. Verified finding, as reported. Determined Ella Hearn died from nervous depression, or similar phrasing, caused by the ball fired from a pistol in the hand of Miss Lily Duer on November 5, 1878. Note: individual juror names are not preserved in the material currently used for this manuscript. 8. Autopsy doctors. Names not preserved in current sources. Role: medical examiners, group. Known for: conducting an autopsy after Ella's death and presenting findings to the coroner's jury. Note: the sources confirm multiple doctors examined the body, but do not preserve their individual names in the material currently used. 9. The sheriff. Name not preserved in current sources. Role: custodial authority during trial. Known for: choosing not to confine Lillian Duer in jail. Lodging her at the National Hotel across from the courthouse, stating jail was no fit place for a young woman. Note: his name is not preserved in the material currently used for this manuscript. Unresolved identities. Mentioned, but not named in current sources. These people appear in accounts but cannot yet be named using the sources currently in hand. The neighbor/passerby who reportedly heard the gunshot and scream and ran into the Hearn home immediately after the shooting. Additional visitors during Ella's illness. Friends, neighbors, caretakers, referred to generally but not named. Any law officers involved in locating or returning Lillian after her flight. Court personnel, jurors, or additional witnesses, likely named in full trial reporting but not preserved in the current extracts. Bibliography. Primary sources: Contemporary Newspapers, 1878 to 1879. Baltimore Evening Bulletin. Reports and interviews concerning the shooting of Duer-Hearn by Lillian Duer and subsequent developments, November, December 1878. The New York Times. The Pocomoke City tragedy, and related reporting on the Duer-Hearn case and trial proceedings, 1878 to 1879. Philadelphia Times. Trial coverage and testimony reporting from Snow Hill, Maryland, May, June 1879, widely reprinted in other papers. The Daily Times, Salisbury, Maryland. Local and regional coverage of the shooting, Duer-Hearn's condition, and subsequent legal proceedings, 1878 to 1879. The Worcester Daily Spy, Massachusetts. National reprints and summaries relating to the case and its developments, 1878 to 1879. The North State, North Carolina. Strange developments, and coverage of the coroner's inquest following Duer-Hearn's death, December 1878. The Evening Bulletin, San Francisco, California. Reprinted testimony and case summaries, including witness statements, 1879. The Philadelphia Inquirer. Reprints and summaries of the Snow Hill trial and verdict, 1879. Coroner's inquest/legal findings, as reported in Period Press. Coroner's jury verdict, Pocomoke City, Maryland. Findings on the death of Duer-Hearn attributing cause of death to the ball fired from a pistol in Lillian Duer's hand, December 1878, reprinted in regional newspapers. Court proceedings, Snow Hill, Maryland. Trial of Lillian Duer for the shooting death of Duer-Hearn, May, June 1879, including the verdict of manslaughter and fine. Secondary sources, modern histories, analysis and reprints. Pocomoke Public Eye. Time Machine series and related archival posts reproducing and contextualizing 19th century reporting from the Philadelphia Times and other newspapers on the Duer-Hearn case. Chesapeake Area Queer History Publication, PDF. Modern compilation and synthesis of period sources and testimony regarding the relationship between Lillian Duer and Duer-Hearn, their education, the shooting, inquest, and trial. LGBTQ historical research summaries and collections. Modern historical overviews drawing on period reporting and court accounts of the Duer-Hearn case, including discussions of women's same-sex relationships and public response in the 19th century. Suggested archival/genealogical records for verification, for appendix development. United States Federal Census Records, 1860 to 1880. Entries for Hearn and Duer families in Worcester County, Maryland, for family structure, occupations, residence. Maryland State Archives. Coroner's inquest files and court records for Worcester County, if extant, including trial docket entries and indictments. Worcester County, Maryland Court Archives. Indictments, case files, and trial documentation from the 1879 proceedings at Snow Hill. Local church registers and cemetery records, Pocomoke City/Worcester County. Burial and family records for Duer-Hearn and the Hearn family.